Jesus abolished the Old Testament? Here's the truth. Many people assume that Jesus came to do away with the Old Testament, replacing its laws with something entirely new. But is that really what he taught? In his famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus made several bold statements about murder, adultery, divorce, oaths, revenge, and love for enemies. At first glance, some might think he was contradicting Old Testament teachings, but that's not the case at all. Let's take a closer look at what Jesus actually said. In Matthew chapter 5 verses 21 to 22, Jesus addressed the topic of murder. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not murder," and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Was Jesus adding a new law? No. The Old Testament already taught that hatred and discord were wrong. Psalm 133 verse 1 remind us how good and pleasant it is when brothers live together in unity. The issue wasn't that the Old Testament ignored hatred. It was that the religious leaders of Jesus' time had watered down its true meaning. They focused only on physical murder while ignoring the deeper heart issue of anger. Jesus was simply restoring the full meaning of God's law. The same applies to adultery. In Matthew chapter 5 verses 27 to 28, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart." Was Jesus changing the Old Testament law? No. The 10th commandment in Exodus chapter 20 verse 17 already says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife." This means the Old Testament already addressed lust in the heart, but not just physically adultery. Jesus wasn't contradicting the law. He was bringing it back to its original, deeper intent. Jesus also addressed the issue of divorce in Matthew chapter 5, 31 to 32. Many religious leaders of his time believed a man could divorce his wife for almost any reason, as long as he gave her legal documents. But Jesus pointed them back to God's true standard, reaffirming in Malachi chapter 2 verse 16, "I hate divorce, says the Lord." In Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 to 9, Jesus explained further, referring back to the creation story of Adam and Eve to show that marriage was meant to be a lifelong covenant. What about taking oaths? Some religious teachers thought that lying was acceptable as long as you didn't swear an oath. But Jesus corrected this thinking in Matthew 5:33 to 34, telling people simply to be truthful. This aligns with Proverbs 6:16-17, which lists lying as one of the things the Lord hates. Then, in Matthew chapter 5:38 to 39, Jesus addressed the law of an eye for an eye. Many had taken this law, which was originally meant to guide judges in fair punishment, and turned it into an excuse for personal revenge. Jesus rejected this misinterpretation and called his followers to a higher standard, one that reflected God's mercy rather than vengeance. Finally, Jesus spoke about love for enemies in Matthew 5:43 to 44. Some had misinterpreted the command to love your neighbor as permission to hate their enemies. But Jesus set the record straight. God's love extends even to those who oppose us, and so should ours. So, was Jesus rejecting the Old Testament? Not at all. In fact, he said clearly in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Jesus wasn't overturning the Old Testament. He was correcting misunderstandings and reaffirming its true meaning. He used a common rabbinic teaching technique. "You have heard it said, but I say to you." This wasn't mean to replace the law, but to show how it should be rightly understood through Him. By studying Jesus' words in their proper context, we see that He did not come to reject the Old Testament, but to fulfill it, bringing its teachings to their fullest expression.